a very important aspect of remittance of business income abroad, how you can tax it under the domestic tax law, how a domestic tax law conditions of business connection can be narrowed down by a permanent establishment test of the treaty. So now we will learn from our learned speaker how this domestic law versus the narrow down situation of the treaty can be used by the taxpayer for making foreign remittance. Also, we do not have much guidance on how to attribute income under the domestic tax law, only except one rule where global revenue is apportioned and certain jurisprudence on how various income could be proportionately considered as the activity is carried out in India. And therefore we will also learn how such income is attributed according to the operations carried out in India as per the domestic law as well as the treaty law. And at the end of the session, learned speaker has also given one case study that also he will discuss, so that we understand the entire gamut of the practice on business income and its remittances. Now, with that few words on what we are going to learn in the session, let me introduce the learned speaker. He is a director at PwC, and his main area of practice is regulatory aspect and tax aspect on the transaction services. He is having about 15-year experience with him on practicing this area, and very importantly, he is part of and involved in the Center of Excellence at PwC, what we call is knowledge business of the Big Four. Somewhere it is called as knowledge division, somewhere it is called Center of Excellence, and he is playing a very key role in supporting the technical aspects of the practice of the PwC. Friends, his specialization at PwC is financial services. He has dealt with tax and regulatory aspect of banking companies, insurance sector, mutual fund, and other activities in the financial services. More than anything else, the support he gives to his firm also found in the dissemination of knowledge in form of his books. He has authored a book on cross-border services published by the CCH Publications in 2012. It's a very good book. I have gone through almost major part of the book and throw upon a various in-depth analysis and insight of the subject. Then he has authored a book on permanent establishment, the subject which he is going to deal with you today. He's also authored a book on attribution rules of the permanent establishment and on various other topics of his interest. And he has also, I think, written some literatures on futures, options, and tax and regulatory aspects of the status. With this few words of introduction, before I present before I invite Radhakrishna Rawal to speak before you, may I request my president to present a memento as a mark of our love and affection to Radhakrishna, mic is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Mr. Shah, for the nice introduction. Well, let me just first compliment CTC for the nice structure of this course. In fact, I had a word with him maybe about 2 months back, and we agreed on a topic, and then came the detailed description about what I'm supposed to cover. And when I read it for the first time, I found it a little confusing. How is that? Where's the topic? And there were several small topics, and I thought that okay, I've been talking at various forums, so one of my older presentations will hold good. And maybe that's one of the reasons I couldn't give the presentation by the due date. But when I started working on it, what I realized that it was very well thought through and very well structured approach while dividing the topics, amongst various subparts. And so my compliments to the committee for this one. So coming back to today's presentation, there's a broad agenda, for our discussion. I have about 2 hours, 2 hours 15 minutes, or 2 hours including break, to take you through a lot of this. A lot of it is, is a lot of practical aspects. Although there is something is theory, because you can't look at practical aspect without understanding theory. We will make it more practical. We certainly have a lot of interaction during the session. So you please feel free to ask questions. It may happen that when you ask questions, the answer may have been kind of covered in subsequent slides. So I may say that we'll cover up in the subsequent discussion. And because I'm allowing a lot of questions from you, I'm also asking some questions to you. So there's a case study at the end of it. We will take up depending on how much time we have for the session. So let me start with section 195, because the overall structure of this workshop is on withholding on cross-border payments, and essentially you have to look at section 195 when you make a payment to non-resident. And the key parameter, the first thing which you have to determine is that is there an income chargeable to tax you're paying. And if you come to a conclusion that yes, there is chargeable income which a person is paying to a non-resident, there is a requirement of deduction of tax. So a good part of this presentation, deals with only determining is there income chargeable to tax, and there are various nuances of section 195 which I believe are covered in other sections of the first section, which was taken up on section 195. So I'm not going to cover those aspects, but we focus more on determining whether there is an income chargeable to tax or not. And once you come to the conclusion that yes, there is income chargeable, you have an obligation to deduct tax. The next issue which comes up under section 195 is that you do deduct tax at the rates in force. And what is the meaning of rates in force? We have a specific definition of rates in force in section 237A, and which says rates in force is either the rates given in the Finance Act of the respective financial year, or in case of a tax treaty, you will deduct tax as per the tax treaty. So you look at whichever rates are available to you, applicable to the non-resident, and based on that you to determine the rate at which tax is to be deducted. Now, there are several practical aspects which will emerge, when you have the obligation to deduct tax. Okay, it will always not be clear is the income chargeable to tax or not, and the approach of the Indian authorities and the way the law is implemented in India, there is a lot of obligation on the payer, because the department will simply allege that well there was income chargeable to tax, and there is you have defaulted in making a payment. So what does a payer do? Or what does a chartered accountant do when he has to give a certificate? If it comes to business income, then one would want to determine is there a PE created or not. Frankly, as a person making a payment, one does not necessarily have idea about all the activities of a non-resident in India. Okay, unless you are making a payment to a related enterprise, you are bound to know everything. But when you are making a payment to a non-resident who is not a related enterprise, you would not know everything what that enterprise is doing. And in larger organizations, even in case of a related enterprise, it's not necessary that you would know what all things your group entities are doing. So then in that case, a lot of reliance is placed on a declaration given by the non-resident saying that he does not have a PE in India. Okay, and that's only a practical solution. Okay, that does not necessarily absolve the payer if that turns out to be a P of the non-citizen in India. But then that's a practical way out. One it's like practiced by a lot of people. So you have a declaration or a management kind of representation, which one takes, saying that there's no P. You still have, okay, now if the facts which are already in your possession of the payer, it raises enough doubt that is the statement correct or not. You may know there are certain facts based on which there is a suspicion that the P is getting created. Then you may not necessarily rely on the declaration, and you are bound to take a practical, call as to whether you should give benefit of Article 7, or you consider there's a P and there should be taxation. So that's a practical call, one would have to take. Also, there are a lot of arrangements wherein contracts are grossed up, okay, and the obligation is on the Indian party to bear the tax liability. Now, in that case, probably, one may want to take an aggressive stand and determine the tax liability and come to a conclusion that, one need not deduct tax, because ultimately, it's not deducting tax from, the tax hit is on you, is on the payer. And that's the reason why one may not want to deduct the tax, take an aggressive stand, and pay the discharge tax at a subsequent stage if and when the demand comes up, and litigate the matter in that fashion. But in a situation where the contracts are not to be grossed up and the tax is to be ultimately borne by the non-resident, you certainly want to ensure that as a payer you will go on a defensive side. Okay, even if you feel that, well, there is an element of doubt, as a payer you would always want to play safe, and as a conservative basis you will want to deduct taxes. Now, this approach, at times results in kind of, a standstill position, or the contracts don't move, or the contracts fail. If the payer insists that I'm going to deduct tax, and then people come to a kind of a practical solution. If the non-citizen strongly feels about his technical position, he may want to give an indemnity to the Indian payer, saying that in case in the future the departments decides, or the litigation is comes to in favor against the assessee, and it's held that the income is taxable, then the non-resident will indemnify the Indian payer. So while we'll go through the taxability, these are some of the aspects which practically one has to kind of go through, and while advising on withholding aspects or implementing the remittances. Okay, now let me spend some time on the basics. The chargeability is under Section 5. Okay, it says under Section 5, what is subject to tax in India: income received or deemed to be received in India, income accruing, arising, or deemed to be accruing, arising in India. And what is the most difficult part of it is determination of when the income accrues in India. At what point of time you can say the income has arisen in India or income arises in India. There is no statutory definition of it. There is no statutory guidance, and probably it's not possible to kind of lay down a proper law as to when the incomes can be said to be arise in India. And we have a plethora of cases dealing with what is accruing, what is arising. And some of the courts, some of the judges have made very interesting observations. They said that originally in 1918, under 1918 Act, a particular scheme prevailed dealing with accruing and arising. In 22 Act, they found that the scheme was not working. In 22 Act, they made further amendment. They were still not happy. There were still loopholes. In 23 Act, they further amended. In 29 Act, they further amended. 61 Act, the same thing continued. But in 76, they came up with the limiting provisions. So the courts have approved that probably even the legislature or the draftman had taken 4 attempts to come to something which can be said to be a balanced kind of a law, what they wanted to say, the kind of scheme they wanted to lay down. Very interestingly, when you look at the judicial precedents, and there are plethora of judicial precedents dealing with the issue, and you will find a clear approach from the courts and the approach was little reluctant to lay down a clear law. A court would clearly make an observation saying that we are not laying down a generic law on the issue, we are only deciding the specific facts of the case. And this is not to be treated, as applicable in all the situations. So there is a reluctance on the part of the judicial authorities, on this issue, and that's something which makes, understanding accruing and arising much more difficult. And the question is, where does the income accrue? And the issue becomes, relevant in situations wherein a part of the transaction is carried out in India and part of the transaction is carried out outside India. Is it the place at which the sales are executed? The sales contract is signed. Is there the place of accrual? Is there the place where the goods are delivered? Is there the place of accrual? Is the place at which the business operations are performed? Is there the place of accrual? Section 5 also talks about source of income. Is the place where the source of income is situated? Is it the place where the income accrues? And you'll find a lot of cases, dealing with specific situation, and each of these probably you'll find few cases which says it's the place of sale where the income accrues, is a place of signing of execution of contract where the income accrues. So you'll find cases all over. We had a very interesting case law in the case of Performing Rights Society, and very old case, wherein All India Radio, has obtained a license from Performing Rights Society, probably a UK entity, for broadcasting English music in India. The contract was signed in London, and the music was played in India. And the question was, where does the income accrue? And the Supreme Court said that the income accrues in India, because the music is getting broadcasted in India, that the economic activities happening in India. Again, in UK probably there was a series of judgment which says that the income accrues where the brain of the business is situated, because ultimately this business is driven from here. It's not the guys who are really executing it, and the place where the brain of the business is situated, that's the place of accrual. We had a Supreme Court ruling in the case of Chimannal Mehta, which kind of reversed the trend. There was a case wherein an Indian resident, Chimannal Mehta, was dealing in derivatives contract in overseas exchanges. So he would give instructions to purchase and sell derivatives from India. The contracts would be executed in London or whichever other exchanges. And the question was, where does the income accrue? Where does the income accrue? And the Supreme Court said that okay, fine, although the brain is sitting in India, but the contracts are ultimately getting executed in other country. So you have purchase and sale of derivatives happening outside India, and that's how the income does not accrue in India. So, net we had a lot of litigation around this, and there's one more aspect of source of income which is also relevant. The question is, the theory is that the income accrues where the source of income is situated, and then the question comes up, what is the source of income? The source is something which is not, determined. Someone said that, yes, sun is the source of sunlight. Okay, a river, or Himalayas is the source of, rivers. But then, what is the source of income? Who determines? Because it's written it's as it's understood in the plain language, in layman's term. Is the payer of the income? Payer is the source of income. Is the economic activity a source of income? Is the business unit, enterprise, undertaking a source of income, and so on. And again, on all of this, you'll have multiple case laws dealing with saying that no, this is a source of income. You'll also find cases wherein there's a dispute as to what is the source of income, and this, especially again comes up when part of the activities happen in India, part outside India. It's possible to contemplate a situation wherein a particular item of income has multiple sources. Well, let's talk about this workshop. The owner of this room, the building, earns maybe probably rentals from this, and if you have to determine what is the source of income from him, Is the source of income the seminar, workshop? Is the source of income his ownership right in the building or this particular hall? Is the source of income CTC, which is making the payment? Or is the source of income each of you participant who is ultimately contributing to the renters for this hall? So probably we can make an observation, and it's a fact that our particular source of income can have multiple sources, and when the sources are situated across the geographies, that's where the real challenge comes in. And a lot of I've summarized a lot of the case laws in a specific chapter of my book. Probably the principle which is emerging is that the courts have given more importance to the economic activities as a source of income. Vis-a-vis the player or the business unit or a contractual obligation or an inventor act or a board resolution. So the courts probably are giving more importance to economic activity as a source of income, but that may not necessarily be a universal truth. It will depend on the facts of the case. So let's see what has happened because of all this. Okay, we saw that it's difficult to determine what is source of income. It's difficult to determine what is where does the income accrue. It's difficult to determine where does the income arise. And we had plethora of judicial precedents dealing with all this. And then probably in 1976, the parliament thought, the legislature thought that there should be an easier solution to this taxation. And that's where they came out with the dimming provisions in section 9. There were a lot of disputes around royalties, FTS, interest. So we introduced, the parliament introduced the source rule in section 9, which is the dimming provisions for interest, royalties, interest, and some other items of income. So then we have section 9. Now, very interestingly, what has happened, and especially when I look at the judicial precedents in last 25 years or so, and also look at the approach of the authorities, and also look at the approach of the professionals, including myself, some of the advices which I may have given, and also approach of the industry. The approach is that probably we have stopped looking at section 5. The approach is that we just look at section 9. We determine that the income is not deemed to accrue or arise in India, and that's the end of it. And then we don't look at section 5. Whereas the correct position is that you have to, before saying that income is not subject to tax in India, you have to satisfy that income does not accrue in India under section 5, and it's also not deemed to accrue or arise in India in section 9. Okay, because section 9 is so convenient, there's a lot of comfort applying these provisions. The simple approach is that section 9 does not apply, and that the income is not taxable. There are a number of cases wherein significant business activities are performed in India. Okay, and one would simply say that, well, the income accrues in India, and once you come to conclusion income accrues in India, there is not even a need to look at section 9. Okay, because you determine the place of taxation. But there are a number of judicial precedents which you can find out that even the judicial authorities or the tax department has not invoked section 5 at all. Okay, if you look at some of the very recent cases, Pramod Kumar in Wright Florist, he's made a good analysis of this topic, and he's reinforcing the fact that you can't forget section 5. You have to necessarily look at section 5 even if the income is not deemed to accrue in India. So the point which I want to make is that practically when we give advices to our clients or when we determine issue of taxation for non-residents, we can't be ending our search, we can't be ending stopping our analysis at section 9. If we come to a conclusion that the income is chargeable under section 9, good enough, the life becomes easier. But if we come to conclusion income is not chargeable under section 9, one has to necessarily go to section 5 and see whether the income is subject to tax as per section 5 or not. Okay. Now let's look at the broad structure of our domestic law. Interestingly, a lot of the situations involving cross-border transactions are, in a way covered by specific provisions. So, if you have to determine the method of taxation as per domestic law, I can, broadly determine, divide them in three categories. Net basis of taxation, which is income minus all possible expenses. But this net basis of taxation creates a lot of problems where part of the expenses are incurred in other countries, part of the operations are performed in other countries. And that's why we have a gross basis of taxation. So you have section 44DA, you have section 115A, wherein X percentage of your income, the tax is levied on X percentage of your income, and that's the final tax. And then we have presumptive basis of taxation. So you have your 44B, BB, there's a series of sections which deal with presumptive basis of taxation. And there's the presumption is that 10% of your income, maybe 15% of your gross income is treated as, is presumed to be taxable income, and the applicable rate is applied on that presumed income. And then you have, rule 10, which also kind of gives certain methods, but rule 10, is to be applied in rare situations, when everything else fails. Well, we have, some very interesting issues arising from section 44BB. I mean, to my mind, probably there is, a fault in the structure itself. 44BB, gives a presumptive basis of taxation for service providers, to oil and gas sector. And what is excluded from that is something which qualifies as fees for technical services. And because of that, there is a huge amount of litigation. It's probably impossible to contemplate a situation wherein a foreign service provider who is rendering services for oil and gas sector, his income does not qualify as FTS. Okay, and that's the mother of all the litigation on this particular section. The correct technical position is that, if we don't have to kind of question the structure of the law, the correct position is that something which qualifies as a FTS does not qualify for section 44 benefit. There was a series of remnant rulings, which kind of gave a lot of importance to the structure of the sections, and the argument that the 44BB would become a redundant kind of a section. They gave in favor of the SSCs and then gave benefit of 44BB, even in cases where the income was qualifying as FTS, and the trend is getting reversed at the Uttarakhand High Court level. So I mean that's where the issue is. So if we when you have to have an occasion to advise on taxability under section 44BB, remittances around those service providers, one has to be a little more careful. So having dealt with the broad scheme of taxation under the domestic law, let's look at some aspects of the tax treaties. Well, any questions from the audience till this stage? Okay. If there are no questions, then it's certain that my questions need to be answered by you because we are certainly going to case studies. Okay. Well, we have section 90 under which the tax treaties are entered into. Section 90 subsection 2 effectively says that the SSC has the option of claiming the benefit of the domestic law or the tax treaty, whichever is a beneficial to him. And this option itself creates a lots of issues, lots of debates, lots of discussions. And as we chartered accountants try to do it smartly, okay, what people did, they try to do pick and choose. So they will apply part of the provisions of domestic law, part of the provisions of the tax treaties. And I would want to kind of divide this pick and choose in three categories. Okay, a simple pick and choose could be year-on-year pick and choose. So what I do is that in year 1 I would claim benefit of tax treaty, in year 2 I'll say, okay, fine, I don't like tax treaty, I'll go under domestic law. In year 3, again, I'll say, well, I have the option of deciding whatever I want to do. And when will I do this? Let's presume a situation where, there's a branch, and there's a tax rate of a branch under the domestic law as well as treaty. If under the domestic law there's a loss which is allowed to me, I will say the domestic law is more beneficial, and I would want to go with domestic law and carry forward my losses. And when it comes to taxable year, I would say no, hold on, treaty is more beneficial to me, I want to go ahead with treaty. And then the question comes up, is this the right kind of an approach? And probably the answer is that the language of section 90 subsection 2 is is wide enough that gives me an option to select whichever is beneficial to me. And are the option, I can exercise the option. And some of this, in fact, most of this is kind of backed by judicial precedents. So when you look at the cases, some of this is, a lot of this is getting kind of endorsed by the courts and tribunals as well. The second kind of pick and choose I can talk about is pick and choose based on source of income. So what typically one want to do, let's think about a Mauritian company. The Mauritian company earns two kinds of income from India. It earns dividend income, it earns capital gains. And as an SSC, what would I want to do? I would want to claim that under the domestic law, there is no tax on dividend. So for dividend income, I would rely on domestic law. And when it comes to capital gains, I say, okay, but in the Mauritius treaty, Mauritian company need not pay tax on capital gains in India. So for capital gains, I will rely on the tax treaty provisions. So I do pick and choose based on the source of income. And this is very common, all the companies do it. And then again the courts have the tribunals have approved this. The language of the section 92 is probably clear enough to say that there's no problem with this. You can select whichever is more beneficial to you. Probably what I find more difficult and more unreasonable is the third kind of pick and choose, and I'll call it mix and match kind of a situation. And in that, what people have done, and a lot of the cases which are listed on the screen are dealing with this, except the first one, the rest three are kind of in favor of the SSE. What people have done, they would borrow the definition of PE from the domestic law, if that's a narrow definition, and export it to tax treaty and apply the tax treaty in that basis. Or they will borrow the definition of FTS, let's say make available clause, and import it in section 44DA and say 44DA is not to be applied, domestic law not to be applied. So this is something which to my mind is an extreme level of pick and choose. But barring this one particular Dresdner Bank case, it has passed the test of the tribunal, and the tribunals have held that okay, fine, section 90 subsection 2 is wide enough, and the SSC has the option to go for whichever is more beneficial to him. Obviously, the Pune Tribunal and Patni computers made very good observation. It recognizes that probably this is not the right thing which is happening, and it ends by observing that it's probably for the legislature to kind of correct the situation if unintended benefits are going to the tax assessing officers, so to the SSCs. Now, in a practical scenario, one may have to take a call as a payer, to what extent you want to entertain this, pick and choose. Maybe if it is scenario 1 and 2, one can easily give that kind of a benefit and, let the remittance go. But when it is the third category of mix and match, to my mind, it would, it becomes much more aggressive, and one may want to be a little more careful. In fact, even why we are talking about mix and match on treaties, like Mauritius, or the ground level reality is that the payers are not willing to give kind of remittance or sales consideration without withholding. because they find that the moisture-city is there are a lot of issues despite Azadi Bachao, despite TRC circular and all that. There are still a lot of litigation at the ground level. You go to the department under 195, 197, you don't get a certificate so easily, and this is a real blocker to a lot of the live transactions which are happening as regards the sale of Indian shares by the merchant companies. So one has to carefully see what kind of pick and choose the non-student entities indulging into, and then talk about then consider the remittance aspect. Then let me talk about another subsection in section 90. And I mean this became very prominent last year when the government tried to kind of make some changes to this. Let me just read out. It says, any term used but not defined in this act or in the agreement referred to in subsection 1 shall, unless the context otherwise requires and is not inconsistent with the provisions of this act or agreement, have the same meaning as assigned to it by the Indian notification by the central government. Now I want to kind of stress on the words unless inconsistent with the provision of this act or the agreement. So here you're talking about a situation wherein the government would give meaning to a particular term for the purpose of tax treaties. That's the power given to the term, to the government. And then subsection 3 also says that okay, fine, the government will give the meaning for a tax treaties, but there's a possibility that the meaning given may not be consistent with the tax treaties, or may not be in the right context. So I find it a little strange that when the government is defining a particular word only for the purpose of tax treaties, how can it be inconsistent? Okay, probably the answer could be that different meanings may have to be adopted for different treaties. A particular word may have to be interpreted in a particular way for one particular treaty and in a different manner for some other treaty. Well, as an SSE, it gives me the ability to argue that subsection 3 itself recognizes that the meaning may not be consistent, and that gives me an additional defense to say that the meaning given by the government in the notification may not be applied. Now, I mean this subsection has been there in the statute book for some time. So far we have seen only one notification coming from this, which is the word may be tax, and which is essential to plug the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Kulungan Chettiar. Well, let's come to another very interesting part of it, which is the TRC requirement. After Azadi Bachao and after Circular 769, on Mauritius, it was kind of a settled position that if the foreign company produces TRC, the benefit of tax 18 needs to be given based on such TRC produced by the foreign company. Then in 2012, the government thought of coming up with this subsection. And this is the final amended version of subsection 4. The earlier subsection contemplated that the government would come out with a format, and the TRC needs to be consistent with the format. I mean, obviously, it was a very difficult proposition. One cannot expect about 85 or 90 countries around the world with which India has signed a tax treaty to produce TRC as per the Indian format. Each sovereign will have its own rules with own forms in which the government or the tax department of that country is going to issue TRC. The Indian government cannot say that you give me a TRC as per the format prescribed by India. And there were a lot of hue and cry created around this provision, because people really found that this is going to be a nightmare if this becomes a law. And probably the good sense prevailed, and they amended, they kind of dropped that idea of prescribing a format for TRC. Instead of that, they came out with another version which said that it should contain, the documents or the information as may be prescribed, and subsequently this has been backed up, by a specific rule, based on which kind of one needs to look at when the TRC is obtained. Now, practically, if you have to give TT benefit, you have to ensure that TRC is there. You can't think of giving a TT benefit without TRC in your hand. Now, what I find challenging, and in some of the cases, I've seen that this is not an issue. But if a government of a country has to certify that a particular person is a tax resident of a country, when can that certification happen? The parameter for residential status is based on number of days in case of an individual, in case of companies, in corporation, and maybe control and management. How can on 1st of April 2014 I can give a certificate that Mr. X is a resident of country A for the year starting 2014? Any tax authority would want to give that certificate only after end of the year, because the certification can be given only after the end of the year. Okay, so if looked at from that perspective, this thing again becomes kind of non-operational, because when you have to make a remittance, you would want to make a remittance during the year. Okay, at that point of time you need TRC. But in a practical experience, fortunately I have not seen this becoming an issue. A lot of the clients have been managing to get a TRC even before the end of the year. So, but that could be an issue, if the domestic law of other country has different rules. Yeah.
If I have in middle of the year any transaction, how we would go about it?
Well, it depends on which side I am. If I am on the side of the payer, I will say, okay, fine, if you want a benefit, give me TRC. This is the section which requires you to give me TRC. And if you manage to give me TRC, I'll give the benefit. If he comes back saying that, okay, fine, but the year is not over.
No, suppose he said, I will give you the end of the year, and suppose we have remitted the amount, we have not deducted here, so without any tax. And what are the, suppose he writes, you will furnish, and later on he could not give.
Well, then that becomes a little bit of practical call or also a commercial call. You obviously as a professional, as a payer, as a businessman, you understand the ground realities, and you want to continue your trade, your business. Okay, if you really want to become a strict saying, no, I will not give you this unless you give me a TRC, probably, that may be the last time you are dealing with the person. Okay. Practically, you may want to see whether he has been able to get TRC in the last year, unless it's an individual kind of a thing, one may think that, okay, fine, a company will continue to be a resident of a particular country. So you make, a kind of declarations, you'll take a kind of a declarations from that non-resident, and, maybe take an indemnity kind of a thing, saying that, okay, fine, I'll reproduce TRC at the end of the year. Okay, but nonetheless, you continue to be, taking that business risk,
If we do it withholding amount, we just keep on hold until unless he furnishes the TRC.
Well, that would have its own kind of complications. If I don't remember the provisions correctly now, but if I remember correctly, deducting tax and not depositing is probably a criminal offense. The Kingfisher is facing it now, so that will have its own implications. Yeah.
How much indemnity is helpful, because the payroll is away, outside India, and then usually we agent to photo flow abroad and engage big team of lawyers.
Yeah, it has its practical considerations. For smaller businesses, it would become difficult. But when probably when bigger brands are involved, people would want to kind of
Bank guarantee or something.
Yeah, if it is bank guarantee, then nothing like it. But when the bank guarantees are not possible, it's a business call one has to kind of deal with. But yeah, it's an issue. It's an issue. How do you kind of go for implementation of it?
what is the risk? I continue the same example. What is the risk of a chartered accountant issuing a certificate? Because the law requires the assessee to operate the TRC. Also, he is making the payment. He it is not compulsory for him. All practical purpose, he has to be direct. So, what is the risk the chartered accountant will issue without taking the obligation of TCR?
No. As far as CA is concerned, I'm backing myself, by a kind of a representation letter or a letter. So I'm always going to say I give the certificate basis that he is going to produce the TRC. The risk is always with the payer. Yeah, but then I have an adequate defense. I have taken due care to ensure if one of the parties of the transaction does not fulfill his obligation, probably then this is his fault. As a professional, I have taken enough care. I may want to warn my client, as he is pointing out that there's a business risk. Okay, but then ultimately it's the client's call. How we want to do his business. Okay, let's look at another very interesting issue, and which to my mind is live and taking for adequate number of years now. We have a definition of P under the domestic law under section 92F3A, and this definition came in as a part of the transfer pricing provisions. Subsequently, this definition has been adopted for the purpose of section 44DA as well, which is saying that if you are P in India and if the fees or royalties are effectively connected to the P, then you have to go for net basis of taxation. And the question which comes up, is that this is a kind of a limited P definition. But it's an inclusive definition. The issue is what you do. Would you say that a service P is to be treated as a P under 92F3A? Would you say that agency P is to be treated as a P under 92F3A? Let's look at how things evolved. When this particular definition was when the TP provisions were introduced for the first time, there was, although the word P was used in the sections, there was no precise definition. And Circular 14 of 2011 said the term P has not been defined in the provisions, but its meaning may be understood with reference to the tax cities entered into by India. So this was the original intention. Let's just try to understand what kind of results this would have produced. Okay, let's say you are doing a transaction with a Hong Kong company, and you have to determine whether a Hong Kong company has a P in India or not. How will you determine? You don't have a treaty with Hong Kong. Would you apply a treaty with France to determine there's a P of the Hong Kong company in India or not? Would you look at the UK treaty? Will you look at the US treaty? So this could have really resulted in a lot of complications, but probably good sense prevailed and they introduced the definition. But they introduced the inclusive definition, and then the memorandum says that it is proposed and to provide a separate definition of P on the lines of the definition found in the tax cities entered into by India. So the intention is very clear. They wanted to replicate the concept which prevails, in international taxation in tax cities in the domestic law as well. Okay, but the question still remained open. What you are incorporating in section 92F3 is essentially para 5.1, article 5.1. What about service P? What about agency P? Is the inclusive feature of your definition good enough, adequate enough to argue, to come to a conclusion that you have a P in terms of the domestic law as well, and service P is to be treated as a P under the domestic law itself. The case could be argued both ways. One may want to say that if a concept of P of the treaties is to be introduced, was to be inserted in the domestic law, then you can't rely on that. Even internationally, if you are to hold that there is a service P, you need a specific definition of service P in the tax city. Without that, you can't argue that there's a service P. You need a specific provision for agency P. Without that, para 5.1 is not adequate enough to claim that as a agency P. So, how do you do it? Probably to my mind, the issue is open. This this may, I mean, surprisingly, it has not resulted in a big litigation till date. But this could happen anytime. In Morgan Stanley, Supreme Court did make observations to the effect that the definition of P in a domestic law would cover service P, agency P, etc. But then, to my mind, that's only an obiter. To my mind, the Supreme Court was not commenting. The issue before the Supreme Court was not this. Is its passing reference. Supreme Court has made some observations. So, I mean, let's look at practically what does it mean. As a chartered accountant, if I have to certify the remittance, do I apply Section 44DA in a situation wherein under the treaty there is a service P, but under the domestic law there is no 5.1P. So do I give kind of effect to the inclusive feature of the definition and say that the presence of employees for 90 days, for 60 days, for 120 days does create a P, and that's why Section 44DA is to be implemented, or the income is to be taxed on a net basis. I mean, to my mind, it's a complex issue. There's no clear answer on this, and as it happens, as a payer, you would want to go conservative and want to take a view that there's a P. Now, interestingly, the matter does not end there, because when you are implementing a gross basis regime versus net basis regime, you may end up in a situation that when you hold it as a P, because of deductions you may give, the ultimate tax which you deduct could be lower. Okay, and that one you may still want to argue, no, there was no P created here. Where is the P created? Had you deducted 25% gross, the tax would have been much more, you should have deducted much larger amount. So that's another issue. So this to my mind is really a difficult one. Okay, and then we come to Article 5 and Article 7. I mean, there are a lot of detailed slides on when the P is constituted. I think we'll not go through all of this. We can just restrict ourselves to broadly understanding the concept of P. Okay, the P concept is important because that determines the taxability of business income. Okay, I mean, let me just talk broadly about the scheme of the tax treaty. The tax treaties give full taxing rights to a source country if there is a P created. If the presence of non-resident is significant on the soils of a particular country, that country is logically given rights to tax the non-resident on a full basis. So it's a full taxing rights given to that country, and that's where your Article 5 and Article 7, Article 5 defines what is a P. If P is constituted, there is no cap on the rate at which the income of the non-resident can be taxed. If there is no P created, then the rights of the domestic law, the rights of the source country are capped, and that's where your Article 10, Article 11, Article 12 will prescribe the higher rate beyond which the taxation cannot go. So you may have a Article 11 or 12 which will say the royalties or FTS cannot be taxed at a rate higher than 15% or 10%, as the case may be. So that's the overall significance of P. You have to determine is there a P created, and is the presence of a non-resident significant enough in India to come to a conclusion that there's a P created. So and let me tell you that I would say at least 30 to 40% of the litigation is around determination of P and attribution. So this becomes a much more complex thing to come to a conclusion to see is there a P or not. Practically, as a payer, I will not always have a complete visibility of all the activities of a non-resident. So I may want to, kind of rely on a certificate, from non-resident to say that there's no PE created, and go on that basis. Broadly, there are three kinds of PEs. One is fixed place PE, Article 5(1), which is the main PE, and then you have agency PE, which is created because of the activities of certain activities of a dependent agent. If the agent has the ability to conclude contracts and is maintaining stock of goods and delivering goods from that, or is kind of procuring orders. In that case, agency PE gets created. And the third category of PE is a service PE, which is coming from UN model, and which is getting created as a result of presence of employees in India and because of the employees rendering services in India. Let me just kind of deal with some of the aspects of service PE. When you look at the service PE clause in the UN model, okay, it has a particular regime, and when it gets adopted in Indian tax treaties, there are significant variations, changes done to that. The first change, is that the UN model talks about 183 days, but the days to be counted are for same or connected project. So if you are carrying on separate projects, different projects for different kind of people or different clients, then you don't have to kind of aggregate all the days for this people. You have to take them separately. So your 180 days is to be applied qua contract, on a separate basis. Whereas when you look at the Indian tax treaties, we are not adopted that particular clause. So the bracket same or connected project does not exist in Indian tax treaties. Another feature of Indian tax treaties is that we have article dealing with fees for technical services in most of our tax treaties. So there are some exceptions, but most of our tax treaties do have an article dealing with fees for technical services. And what it means is that your service PE clause is defined in a different manner. It says that only if you don't fall within Article 12, the service PE becomes relevant to you. Then we have make available provisions, in some of the tax treaties. Only if you don't make available, then you have a service PE obligation. Another interesting feature of Indian tax treaties is that in UN model, service PE is following Article 5.3 and 5.3b, whereas most of the Indian tax treaties is included as one of the clauses of Article 5.2. And the general understanding is that Article 5.2 elaborates what is stated in Article 5.1, and the items listed in Article 5.2 need to satisfy the parameters or the test of Article 5.1 as well. So then the question which comes up is that if Article 5.1 contemplates a fixed place of business, which is kind of a branch or an office, kind of a situation, is it necessary that even for service PE, the Article 5.1 test should necessarily be, kind of satisfied? And the answer to my mind is clearly no. Although in Indian tax treaties, service PE clauses, kind of getting mixed up in Article 5.2, para 2 of Article 5, it is still a separate code in itself. It is to be implemented, is to be applied separately, notwithstanding the fact that requirement of Article 5.1 is not getting satisfied. And over the period of time, this view is also getting kind of endorsed by various tribunals. That means the SSCs, did make an argument that, well, we did render services, but we didn't have Article 5.1p, so there is no PE created, and then the department did not accept it, and the judicial authorities also did not accept this. Another interesting issue which comes up is that how do you determine the number of days test? if you have, let's say, 5 employees rendering services on a particular day, do you calculate this as 5 days or you take it as only 1 day? And then, we have some cases not in the context of service P, but in the context of Article 15, wherein the tribunals have held that, okay, fine, you can't take it as a 5 days, you have to take it as a 1 single day. Okay, another interesting issue which comes up, is out of the deputation arrangement. We have a, we have a lot of the real life situations wherein the employees are deputed. A parent company would depute some of the key employees to India. And the question is, does it create a service P because of these employees? And the issue arises not only because of this. The issue also arises because of the FTS definition which we have. The FTS definition has certain words within bracket which says including making available personnel, technical or other personnel. And the question is, how do you determine there's a service being created or not? How do you determine whether what services are rendered? To my mind, if the deputed employees are reporting to the Indian Board of Directors, if the deputed employees, if the foreign company is not responsible for the work done by the by the employees who are deputed to India, in that case the foreign company is not rendering any services. It's always a pure deputation contract. But if the foreign company is responsible for the work done or the output of the deputed employees, then there is no service. Then there's a rendition of services by the foreign company, and service P could be triggered because of that. We have a classic observation in the case of Morgan Stanley. Okay, unfortunately, the way the judgment is given, it creates a lot of confusion. The Supreme Court has endorsed, laid down the same principle which I just narrated, but on the facts of the case, in the subsequent lines, the Supreme Court said that the service P is getting created. So that's something which is creating a lot of confusion on this issue. Okay. Now here the issue is what I discussed, that if there are 5 people working in India.
Like for example, say one person will say that they are under me, 4 people are under me as a contract.
No, then you would, that's right. So if there are 5 people working on a particular day, let's say 5 people working for 5 days, then would you say that the services are rendered for 25 days? Or would you say the services are rendered only for 5 days? And the logical answer which is coming from the judicial precedents is that it's to be taken as only 5 days, not 25 days. And the courts have, the tribunals have really gone to calculate, saying that in certain situations, you will say the number of days in a year will exceed 365. That cannot be the right solution. So they have come to a conclusion that it's to be taken as a solar days. Yep.
Falling into Article 12 or falling in the definition of FTS, but they do not have a service fee in India, then it is taxed as per Article 12.
Yes.
But if they have a service fee, then it goes into
No. If you are satisfying the definition of FTS, then service fee clause does not get triggered. So there is no question of service fee getting triggered when you are rendering services. When the services qualify as FTS. Okay, but you may have a situation wherein the presence of employees in India results in 5(1) PE. Okay, and then in FTS article you will have para 4 which says that if there's a PE, then you go back to Article 7 and don't talk about don't come to Article. It's getting covered in the subsequent slides, so we will just come to that in a minute. A recent Hyderabad tribunal order is something creating a lot of it's generated a debate. The Hyderabad tribunal says that the Indian PE of a foreign company is to be treated as an Indian resident. Okay, and the tax treatments are to be given accordingly. To my mind, it's really a radical thought that tribunal has gone on the basis that Indian branch had independent, kind of operations. There was a director who was responsible for the operations of the Indian branch, and because of that, the control and management of the Indian branch is entirely situated in India, and then under Section 6, it becomes a resident of India. The tribunal has gone on the basis that Article 7(2) requires that the PE is to be treated as a separate entity, and that's why it should be treated as a resident of India. The tribunal has gone on the basis that if you don't treat this PE as an Indian resident, then you are violating the requirement of Article 24, which deals with non-discrimination. Well, to my mind, it's very interesting kind of a finding, but I want to beg to differ because none of this appear to be adequately satisfactory kind of a argument. Probably Article 7(2) does not tell you that you consider this as a separate resident entity of the source country. Article 24 has a separate paragraphs. The first paragraph deals with nationals, the second paragraph deals with P, the third paragraph deals with non-submission to a resident. The tribunal has not specified which paragraph they are referring to. It does talk about nationality, but then if it's a P, there's a separate paragraph which deals with P. So it doesn't go on that as well. Section 6 requirements, again, to my mind, is not a correct finding, because you have to look at the management control of the entity as a whole, not only of the Indian branch. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to see how the litigation goes on this, because if we come to a conclusion, if we are able to hold that Indian PE is to be treated as an Indian resident, then it will go in a totally different direction. A lot of the tax implications which we are used to handling all these years would result in a significant change.
Supposing that an Indian company has entered into a transaction with a foreign company which has a branch in India, and the transaction of the Indian company is with the branch in India, then in view of this judgment, transfer pricing provisions will not be applicable.
That's what the judgment is saying. The judgment is essentially saying the same thing, that TP is applicable when there are two non-residents involved. It treated the Indian branch as a resident, and they said that TP provisions are not applicable. I mean, to my mind, I have significant doubts.
This is the view expressed. One may or may not agree with that. There is a different question.
Yes, but that's what the tribunal is saying.
That is what the tribunal
is saying. That's what the tribunal is saying. Okay, then comes the question of attribution, Article 7. Now, once you come to a conclusion that a non-resident has a P, then there's the next difficult question to be answered: what is the profit attributable to that P? Because even after having a P in India, the non-resident can be taxed only on that part of the income which is attributable to the P in India, and not on the entire profit. Now, to my mind, the attribution is, the issue of attribution is kind of can be divided in two parts. One is attribution of profits to various activities of the business. Okay, you'll have a situation wherein part of the business operations are performed in one country, part of the operation are performed in another country, and you come to a single amount of profits for all the activities, and how you distribute the profits between two countries. And the second issue is attribution between the head office and the branch. Very quickly, there's a bit of a repetition here. the Indian law has a specific method for taxation. It requires the books of accounts to be maintained. It requires the audit, and all these aspects would help you in determining what is a profit attributable to your to the PE of the non-resident in India. Now, let's look at the issue. I mean, let's look at a situation wherein, let's say, a Singapore company has established a branch in India, and I'm ignoring the FEMA requirement or the FDI requirement or the regulatory requirement for the moment. The Singapore company is in the business of manufacturing and selling cars, and part of the manufacturing activities are performed in Singapore, part of the manufacturing activities are performed in India, part of the sales related activities are performed from Singapore, and the actual sales transactions are performed in India. And for the year ended 2013, March 2013, the Singapore company makes a profits of 10 crores. And then the question comes up is that how do you attribute this 10 crores to the functions performed in Singapore and to the functions performed in India? To my mind, I mean, there is no method in which this could be determined. There is no precise method. I'll come to the TP method separately, but we live with this situation. We live with this kind of a provision for a number of years because our explanation to section 911 also is on a similar lines. It just says that to the extent profits are attributable to the operation in India would tax it. But then where is the guidance? Who determines on manufacturing activities, what is the level of profits, which could be attributable to Singapore and what is attributable in India? And then, we have a number of cases dealing with this, and, some of the court observations I will reproduce here, and courts probably accepted that, attribution is nothing but a guesswork. People have been, guessing, by gut feel that it should be 50% or 20% and all that. And the court said that, okay, fine, we don't want to get indulged in this kind of a guesswork. So what happens is that practically, given the litigation hierarchy in India and the time which we take, it's always the lower level authorities who are better equipped to decide the issue of attribution. After 10 years, then the court, the court has to look at it. Probably nobody will have a grip over the information, and the courts may be reluctant to address the issue of attribution. AR clearly, does not indulge in question of attribution. Let's look at how things have, evolved. I've summarized the findings of some of the reported court cases. Typically, when the assessing officer looks at it, assessing officer says that, okay, fine. I estimate the profits attributable to the operations India is 50%. Okay, SSA is not happy, go to commissioner. Commissioner says, okay, fine, it should not be 50%, it should be 35%. SSA is still not happy, SSA goes to tribunal. Tribunal says, okay, we feel it should not be 35, it should be 25, and it goes on. But nobody had a precise method for determining this. And this tabulates how things have evolved on some of the cases. And probably I see some some hope in the transfer pricing methods, which based on which one is in a position to kind of determine profit attribution or put profit numbers to the functions in a scientific manner. So to that extent, the problem should get resolved, and the issue should be getting reduced on that. Well, and then we have a very interesting debate, not only within India but globally. There was an OECD report on this issue, and the question is, does the arm's length consideration to an agent extinguishes the tax liability of a foreign company? So, a foreign company has an agent in India, and the business is performed through India. If the foreign company is paying arm's length consideration to the agent in India, is there any further tax liability for the foreign company? There was a civility circular, which was interpreted to mean that the foreign company does not have a further liability or taxation. And then we have the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Morgan Stanley, and we have satellite High Court cases. which also endorses the view that there is no further attribution once the agent is compensated. To my mind, there could be further litigation on this issue, because somewhere I feel that the agent and the foreign company are separate taxable entities, and arm's length profit to an agent does not necessarily extinguishes the liability of the foreign company. What time you break? Anytime, whenever you need. Okay.
There is a recent decision from our own tribunal on this point,
Okay.
where they have said that actually if a arm's length price is accepted, then the non-resident further tax liability is terminated. And they have said that because of the Bombay High Court decision, we are bound by that, although they actually express certain reservation.
Yeah.
Morgan Stanley doesn't specifically say that, although there are certain observations.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. In fact, Morgan Stanley, is something which which abruptly says a lot of things without going into detail. And set satellite, when there was a tribunal ruling, the tribunal did held that that's not the end of it. There will be some further attribution, but the High Court kind of reversed it, and there are other rulings as well. But to my mind, one may not treat this as a settled issue, and there should be further litigation on this. Okay, then we have a force of attraction rule in some of our tax cities, which comes from a UN model. Okay, let me just go to the next aspect of attribution, which is the transaction between head office and PE. Now, para 2 of Article 7 says that the PE is to be treated as a distinct and separate enterprise dealing independently with the enterprise of which is a PE. And probably, based on this, there was, a feeling, and there is still a feeling, within the transfer pricing fraternity, that the PE and head office are to be treated as separate enterprises, and there should be arm's length, attribution to those activities. Now, if we see the law which is settled in our country is that nobody can enter into a transaction with self. Nobody can earn profit from self. Nobody can sell goods to oneself. Nobody can declare dividend to oneself. Okay, and we have number of judicial precedents which deals with this issue, that unless there's something specific in the law, it just transferring money from one pocket to another. So the branch and the head office are a single legal entity, and they can be seen as making profits from each other. There is a definition of PE enterprise in section 94F3, and which is not very happily worded. It says enterprise means a person including a PE of such person, and probably it does raise some doubt that is the PE is to be treated as a separate entity. If we look at CBD circular number 14 of 2001, it categorically says that PE is to be treated as a separate entity, and the transaction between PE and the head office are to be treated, need to be at arm's length. Well, to my mind, I don't read this definition to necessarily say that the PE is to be treated as a separate entity, and if the section does not support it, the circular cannot have that meaning. Let's look at what used to happen in tax treaties. We spoke about domestic law, and there's a position in domestic law that the PE, head office, and PE are separate entities. Under the commentary, we looked at para 2 of Article 7, which say that the PE is to be treated as a separate entity. We have para 3 of Article 7, which talks about deductions. And then the question arose, not necessarily in India but internationally, that how to look at head office and PE. Somewhere in late 90s or early 2000, OECD felt the need of examining the issue in greater detail. So it started the project of profit attribution, and it kind of came with series of drafts. The project continued for almost a decade, I would say, and after the decade, after the final conclusion of project, the situation which is emerging is that Article 7, as it prevailed in the OECD model before 2010, and which is the text which is appearing in our older treaties, and the OECD commentary on old Article 7 does not necessarily facilitate arm's length pricing between head office and PE in all the situations. It's only in very restricted specific situations the head office and PE can be dealing with arm's length with each other, not otherwise. And having come to that conclusion, OECD came up with new Article 7 and commentary on new Article 7, which says that which facilitates complete arm's length transaction between the head office and the PE. Now, that's where it is internationally. OECD generally adopts ambulatory approach on its commentaries. That means you have to look at the commentary which prevails when you are implementing a particular structure and when you are examining a particular taxability for transaction. So a commentary written in 2013 is to be looked at when the law is to be applied. That's what it means. But when it comes to Article 7, OECD commentary says that as far as the old text of Article 7 is concerned, one has to look at the old commentary on Article 7 and not the new commentary or not the commentary on new Article 7. So no, that's a specific recognition by the OECD on this aspect. Now, having said that, the transfer pricing fraternity probably is taking a different view. They would want to believe that head office and PE are to be treated as separate entity, even under domestic law as well as the tax treaty. And to my mind, the issue will reach the courts. Very recently in Mitsubishi, one of the arguments which the department had taken is that the definition of enterprise in 92F3A3 gives an implication that head office and PE are to be treated as separate enterprise. The tribunal also did not specifically address that argument, but has said that it's nobody can do business with self. So let me look at briefly touch upon this intra-article exclusion rules. And it's very interesting when you look at para 7 of Article 7, which says where profits includes items of income which are dealt with separately in other articles of this convention, then the provision of those articles shall not be affected by the provision of this article. So essentially it says that if you have a specific article dealing with a particular item of income, so you have certain specific articles in a tax treaty. You have shipping article, you have article for royalties, interest, dividend, fees for technical services. So let's talk about FTS. It says that is an FTS article in which this income is specifically dealt with. Then you don't come to Article 7, you look at FTS article. Then if we go to FTS article, okay, it will also say that this article will not be applicable if the owner of the dividend or FTS has a PE in that other country and the profits or the fees are effectively connected to the PE. So it says that Article 12 does not apply, and you go back to Article 7. You go to Article 7, you read the same thing, and you come to Article 12. The question is, this is kind of creating a circular reference. It does create some confusion, but the way to stop is that you come to Article 10, and then Article 10 tells you to go back to Article 7, and that's where it is. If you look at the overall rationale, is that if there's a PE created, the country gets unlimited right, full taxing right, tax that particular income, and that's why there's an exclusion created in the articles dealing with the specific items of income. So the solution is that after one iteration, you come back to Article 7 and you tax that income as per Article 7, and that taxation is also in accordance with the provision of other articles. Let me stop here.
When the web policy, that means we have to reassemble.
If you just pick the article, just go there.